Italy, 1943. The war had torn the world apart, but in the quiet corners, hidden from the front lines, there were stories no history book would ever tell. In the ruins of Naples, where buildings stood like broken memories and silence weighed heavier than bombs, a strange kind of gathering took place. It wasn't a battle, it wasn't even a negotiation, it was a room full of pain, where dignity had a price. Among those shadows stood Claire Dubois, a French nurse, a mother, a soul holding on by threads. She had lost everything except her son. And then a voice echoed through that dimly lit basement. £10,000, said a man in a British uniform. His name was Captain Richard Evans. He wasn't there to win, he was there to change everything. These aren't just stories, they're memories of courage, of sacrifice, of impossible choices made in impossible times. Welcome to the channel. If you believe these stories should never be forgotten, join us, subscribe now, and turn on the notifications to help keep every memory and every story alive. The war had taken many things from Claire Dubois, her home, her country, her dignity, but not her son. Adrian was all she had left. Just 6 years old, with wide eyes too used to hunger and silence, they lived in the corners of chaos, moving between crumbling buildings and fading hopes. It was 1943, and Naples was nothing more than a shell of itself, held together by fear and desperation. Inside a dim tent at the edge of a makeshift Allied base, Claire sat on a wooden bench, holding a piece of paper with trembling hands. The corners were worn, smudged with dirt and the sweat of uncertainty. It wasn't a letter, it wasn't a command, it was a contract. Captain Richard Evans stood across from her, calm, sharp, a man who had spent too many years making cold decisions in even colder rooms. He didn't look like a soldier anymore. He looked like someone who had learned to hide his pain beneath orders and silence. "There's something I need," he said, his voice quiet but direct. "It's not about love. It's not even about choice. It's survival." He wasn't talking about weapons. He was talking about legacy, about a child he needed to bring into the world. Richard was part of a small, secret branch of intelligence working behind enemy lines. Funding for their operations had started to vanish, and with it, the last hope for hundreds of prisoners scattered across Europe. There was one final chance. A legal clause in an old British inheritance, buried deep in the documents of a long-forgotten family. The heir had to carry the Evans name, and for that, he needed a child. But the condition was clear. After the birth, the child would be raised far away, under another name, in complete secrecy. Claire would have to walk away, forever. "It's just a mission," he said, almost like it wasn't real. "No different from the others." Claire didn't answer right away. Her fingers gripped the edges of the contract. She looked out, through the flap of the tent, where Adrian sat quietly by a crate, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. His cheeks were hollow, his coat was too thin. She had carried him through bombings, hunger, and streets where even daylight felt dangerous. And now she had to make the most impossible choice, not for herself, but for him. "If I do this," she whispered, her voice cracking, "it's for Adrian." Richard said nothing. He just handed her the pen. The moment the ink touched the paper, something inside her shifted. It wasn't about sacrifice, it was about survival. And sometimes those two things were the same. The weeks that followed passed like a blur. Claire was moved to a safe location under Allied protection. She was given food, shelter, and doctors. But none of it felt real. Each heartbeat was a countdown. Each day was a step toward the moment she would have to let go. Richard visited twice. Once to check on her health, and once to leave a small sealed envelope. "If it's a boy," he said softly, "his name will be William." Claire nodded, though the name didn't feel like hers to speak. She didn't ask why. Maybe William was someone Richard had once loved or someone he had lost. War was full of ghosts with no graves. When the time came, Claire held the baby for only a moment. He was small, quiet, with a mark on his cheek that looked like a fading kiss. She didn't cry, not until she was alone. Later, she walked back to her shelter where Adrian was waiting, sitting on the edge of a cot, holding a cup of soup in both hands. He looked up at her and smiled. "Did it help?" he asked. Claire knelt in front of him, ran her fingers through his hair and kissed his forehead. "Yes," she said, "more than you'll ever know." She never saw William again. But sometimes, years later, she would wake in the middle of the night, convinced she had heard a child's voice whispering in English, a name carried by the wind. And in her heart, she would hope he was safe. That somewhere he had found peace, just like she had found hers, not through comfort, but through a choice made with the weight of love. After signing the contract, Claire was taken far from the noise and smoke of the city. The road curved through hills and forests until it reached a quiet old mansion tucked between the mountains near Casino. Time moved differently there. The air was cleaner, and the silence was deep, the kind of silence that could either comfort you or swallow you whole. The house had once belonged to nobility, but now it served the Allied command. Stone walls, creaky floors, faded paintings, and memories too old to speak. It felt forgotten by the war, but not untouched by it. Claire was placed under the care of Elena Rossi, an Italian nurse with sharp eyes and a softer heart. Elena had once been part of the resistance, risking her life in the dark corners of occupied cities. Now she wore a British armband and tried to bring some light into the lives of others. She didn't ask many questions. She understood when someone was carrying more pain than words could explain. Claire never said much either. She helped around the house, took long walks near the orchards, and wrote letters she never sent. Her thoughts were with Adrian, and with the quiet man who kept his distance. Captain Richard Evans stayed in a small room at the back of the mansion, always dressed, always composed, like the war never let go of him. He barely spoke, only nodding when passing by. But Claire had seen him watch the horizon as if waiting for orders that would never come. He moved like a soldier, but his silence said more than any command. Then came the evening that changed everything. The sun was setting behind the hills, casting golden light over the orchard behind the house. Claire had gone looking for fresh air and found him there, alone, tending to the trees. His sleeves were rolled up, hands dirtied with soil, gently adjusting branches and clearing the roots. He didn't look surprised to see her. "Helps to clear the mind," he said without looking up. Claire nodded, stepping closer, but not saying a word. They stood there in the hush of twilight, the breeze carrying the scent of apples and pine. For the first time, there were no ranks, no titles, no missions, just two people broken in different ways, finding stillness in the same place. And in that quiet moment, Claire understood something. The war hadn't just taken buildings and lives, it had taken pieces of everyone it touched, even those who never showed it. Richard was one of them, a man held together by duty and silence. From that night on, the distance between them began to fade, not through words, but through shared glances, unspoken grief, and the strange comfort of being seen by someone who didn't expect you to be whole. The mountains were quiet, but the war still had its way of creeping in, even through candlelight and music. It was a cool evening when Claire was called to join a formal dinner held for a visiting group of Canadian officers. The old mansion had been cleaned up for the occasion. Tablecloths had returned to tables, silverware was polished, and the scent of roasted lamb drifted through the halls, trying to cover the coldness that never really left those stone walls. Claire stood near the mirror in her room, buttoning the last piece of the uniform they'd given her. a modified dress shirt and skirt that looked like it once belonged to a nurse but had been tailored, just enough to pass for a military wife's outfit. It didn't feel like hers, none of it did. But tonight, she would walk into that room as Captain Evans's temporary wife. That was the arrangement. It was part of the story they had told to keep questions at bay and to protect the secret growing inside her. When she stepped into the hallway, Richard was waiting. He looked different in full dress uniform, cleaner, sharper, but the shadows under his eyes were the same. He offered his arm and she took it without speaking. The dining room was filled with voices, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Most of the men were already seated, and when Richard and Claire entered, the room paused for just a moment. Not long, but enough. Claire could feel the weight of their glances. Curious, skeptical, some even cold. She wasn't wearing a ring. She wasn't one of them, and she wasn't supposed to be there. One officer whispered something behind a raised hand. Another smirked and glanced in their direction. Claire kept her chin up. She had survived far worse than stares. As they took their seats, one particularly loud voice at the far end of the table muttered something under his breath about French comforts in British uniforms. Claire felt her throat tighten, but before she could react, Richard leaned forward and spoke, calmly, clearly, and loud enough for the whole table to hear. "She is part of my mission," he said, his gaze firm, "and I take care of what's mine." The room fell quiet for a moment. The smirks disappeared. Claire didn't look at him, but she felt the heat rise in her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but something else, something unfamiliar. It wasn't affection, not yet, but it was the first time someone had stood up for her in a long, long time. Dinner carried on. Plates were served, glasses refilled. The conversation moved to safer topics, shipments, progress, old stories from the field. Claire stayed mostly silent, watching the men around her tell tales to make each other laugh, as if the war hadn't taken everything from some of them. Then, between the second and third course, Richard turned to her and said softly, "I had a brother." His voice had changed. No longer the voice of a soldier at a table, but of a man in the dark, remembering something he had tried not to carry. "Dunkirk. He didn't make it out." Claire looked at him. His fork rested beside his plate. His hands were still. "I was too far away to help," he continued. "And I've spent every day since wondering if I could have done something." There was a long pause. The room's noise faded into the background. "If I ever had a son," he added, eyes distant, "I'd want him to have something better, even if I couldn't stay to give it to him myself." Claire said nothing. There was nothing she could say. The silence between them was full enough, full of stories untold, wounds never stitched, and the quiet understanding of two people who had lost too much to explain in a single night. Later, when the dinner ended and they walked together under the stars, neither spoke. But in the stillness, a quiet bond had formed. Not love, not yet, but the beginning of something that didn't need a name. Not in a place where names were so easily lost. The days after the dinner passed slowly, wrapped in a kind of stillness that only places touched by war can carry. The mansion, once filled with foreign voices and boots on tile, now echoed with silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that lingers after too many words have been left unsaid. Claire began to move through the house with softer steps. The halls felt heavier now, even though nothing had changed, or maybe everything had. The fire in the main room was kept burning low, and outside, the mountain winds grew colder each morning. Winter was near. But even as the silence stretched, something else began to take shape. Something she hadn't expected. It started with a book. One afternoon, returning from the Yule garden, Claire found a worn volume resting on her pillow. The pages were delicate, the cover faded. It was Le Petit Prince, in her native French. A story she had once read to Adrian back in Paris, when their lives still smelled of fresh bread and warm blankets. No note, no explanation, but she knew who had left it. The next day, there was another gift. A small handkerchief placed beside her morning tea. It was embroidered with tiny wildflowers, the kind that bloomed across the fields of Normandy in the spring. Claire held it to her chest for a long moment, eyes closed, heart aching. She had never told Richard where she was from, not out loud. He had listened. Somehow he had listened. These gestures were quiet, nearly invisible, but they spoke louder than any words he could have offered. Claire, who had once seen Richard as a man made entirely of stone, began to notice the cracks. And through those cracks, she glimpsed something tender, something tired, something painfully human. He never mentioned the gifts. He never looked for thanks, and yet his presence grew closer, not in distance, but in weight, in the way his eyes softened when he passed her in the hall, or how his voice lowered whenever they spoke. There was a carefulness in him, like someone trying to rebuild something broken with hands that still remembered what it felt like to lose. One morning, while helping Eleanor sort medical supplies, Claire found herself staring out the window, watching Richard walk through the orchard below. He moved slowly, hands behind his back, as if he was searching for something that could never be found. Elena, without looking up, said, "He lost more than just his brother. He lost the part of himself that believed things could be simple again." Claire didn't respond. She simply nodded, because she had started to feel it too. That strange pull between two people who didn't speak much, but somehow understood the same grief. Two people who didn't know if they were allowed to hope again. That night Claire couldn't sleep. She sat by the fireplace in the quiet study, the book still in her hands, the handkerchief folded in her pocket. When Richard passed by and saw her there, he paused. "You like it?" he asked, motioning gently to the book. She looked up, smiled faintly. "I used to read it to my son. I didn't think I'd ever see it again." He walked in slowly, as if crossing a line he had drawn long ago. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said. "I just thought maybe it would remind you of home." Claire closed the book and held it close. It did, and it didn't. It reminded me of everything I lost, but also of what I still carry. They sat in silence after that. Not the heavy kind, but something warmer. Like the quiet between waves. And in that silence, Claire felt something shift, not just in her, but in him too. She was beginning to see the man behind the uniform, and he, perhaps, was beginning to see the woman who had survived the fire, without letting it take her heart. There are moments during war that leave no sound behind, no explosions, no sirens, no screams. Just a kind of silence that burns deeper than noise ever could. The silence of seeing someone you love, knowing you might never hold them the same way again. Claire had held her pain quietly for weeks, but there was one ache she could no longer silence, the need to see her son. She had never asked for anything since arriving at the mountain mansion. She followed every instruction, accepted every rule. But one morning, just before sunrise, she found Richard alone in the study, flipping through an old intelligence report he didn't seem to be reading. She stood in the doorway, hands clasped in front of her, the words nearly choking her before they left her lips. "May I see Adrian? Just once?" Richard didn't answer right away. He set the file down, eyes fixed on the table. The air between them held the weight of 1,000 unsaid things. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "Yes, but only for a short visit, and he can't know, not the truth, not yet." Claire nodded, already fighting the tears. That was more than she had hoped for. 2 days later, Adrian arrived under careful escort, bundled in a coat too big for him, his small hands gripping a toy soldier missing its arms. Claire stood by the gate when the car pulled up, her legs weak, heart pounding like it was trying to escape her chest. When Adrian saw her, he didn't say a word. He ran, fast, wild, like a boy who hadn't let himself believe this moment could be real. She knelt down just in time to catch him in her arms. The weight of him, the smell of his hair, the warmth of his cheek against hers. It shattered something inside her that she had tried so hard to protect. "Maman," he whispered, wrapping his arms around her neck like he was afraid she might disappear again. "When are we going home?" Claire froze. The question hung in the air like a thread too thin to hold. "Soon," she whispered, stroking his hair. "Very soon, mon cœur." They spent just over an hour together, walking through the orchard, playing in the garden, drawing pictures in the dirt. She gave him some warm clothes, a few pastries Elena had saved, and kissed him at least 100 times. Richard never approached. He stayed by the mansion steps, watching quietly, arms folded, eyes locked on the two of them, as if trying to memorize every detail. And yet, his expression was unreadable. Until Adrian left. As the car drove away, Claire stood still, her arms limp at her sides, staring at the road long after it had emptied. Richard stepped beside her. For the first time, she noticed how tired he looked. Not just from lack of sleep, but from carrying something too heavy for too long. "He loves you," he said quietly. Claire didn't turn her head. She just nodded. "And that's why I did all of this." That night, the house was completely still. Even the wind seemed to soften, as if the mountains themselves understood the weight of what had passed. Claire sat alone in the small garden behind the mansion, wrapped in a shawl, her eyes tracing the stars that peeked between the clouds. She didn't hear Richard approach, but when she turned, he was there, standing under the tree where apples had once bloomed. He looked at her, not with duty, not with command, but with something much deeper. "I don't want you to leave," he said. "Not after the war, not when this is over." Claire's heart tightened. She had never dared to think about after. For people like them, after was always a dream, always a myth whispered between falling bombs. But now, it had a voice. His voice. She didn't answer. Not yet. Because in war, even hope feels fragile. But that night, beneath the quiet stars, a door inside her began to open, slowly, carefully, toward the possibility of something more than survival, toward a future she no longer believed she deserved, but one she was beginning to imagine. Winter came like a slow collapse, cold, silent, and heavy. By January of 1944, the mansion near Casino, once a quiet refuge wrapped in mist and pine trees, had begun to tremble under the weight of distant gunfire. The Battle of Monte Cassino had erupted in the valleys below, and the echoes of war crept steadily up the mountain like a rising tide. The walls no longer felt safe. The windows no longer held warmth. Every morning brought new orders, new tensions, and then came the night. The sky caught fire. The first explosion shattered the eastern wing just before midnight. Claire had been sleeping when the blast shook the ground and sent books tumbling from the shelves. Dust filled the air like smoke from old dreams burning. Somewhere down the hall, someone shouted orders. Soldiers scrambled to secure the building, but it was clear the mansion was no longer a sanctuary. Then came the pain, deep, sudden, and undeniable. Claire clutched her stomach and staggered to the edge of her bed. She didn't need a doctor to tell her. The moment had come. Her body was ready, whether the world around her was or not. Outside, voices yelled for evacuation. The western side was being prepped for retreat. Trucks were lining up near the gates. But Claire couldn't move, not far, not fast. Elena rushed in first, face pale, eyes wide with understanding. "It's happening," she said. Claire nodded, breath shallow. Richard arrived moments later, his uniform covered in soot, a gash bleeding, faintly above his eyebrow. He looked around the crumbling room, then at Claire. "She needs to be moved," Elena said. "No," Claire whispered. "There's no time." And there wasn't. The contractions came faster, closer. The walls rattled again as another blast hit nearby. "Everyone's evacuating," Elena warned, but Richard stood firm. "Then let them go," he said. "I'm staying." Claire reached for his hand, her eyes full of fear. "You can't stay. You'll get trapped." "I've already lost too much," he replied, gripping her hand tighter. "I'm not losing you. Not him. Not tonight." They cleared a corner of the study, placing blankets on the floor. The ancient fireplace glowed faintly, casting shadows on the cracked walls. Elena worked quickly, calming Claire, guiding her through each breath, each wave of pain. Richard never let go of her hand. Outside, the world roared, metal and fire, voices and orders, but inside that room, time stopped. There was only one sound that mattered now, and then it came. A cry, thin, clear, alive. Claire's body collapsed in relief, eyes filled with tears. Elena wrapped the baby in her own coat, gently placing him in Claire's arms. But Richard just stood there for a moment, breath caught in his chest. His hands trembled as he reached for the child. "He's perfect," he whispered, his voice cracking as he cradled the boy against his chest. "He's here." Claire smiled, exhaustion pulling at her, but love holding her steady. Richard lowered himself to his knees beside her, still holding the baby. From his pocket, he pulled out a small box, aged, simple. The velvet faded from years of being carried but never opened. He opened it slowly, revealing a silver ring. Looking into her eyes, still shining through pain, he said softly, "Marry me, Claire. Not because of duty, not because of what we've lost, but because of what we still have. Let's rebuild everything together." Claire's tears fell freely now, not from pain, but from the impossible beauty of surviving something that should have broken them. In that moment, surrounded by rubble, ash, and the fading hum of war, they found something rare. Not just life, but a reason to begin again. By the spring of 1945, the world was still shaking, but in some quiet corners, life was beginning to breathe again. The war hadn't ended, not fully. Far to the east, soldiers still marched through broken cities and snow-covered fields. But in the newly freed lands of Western France, the guns had fallen silent, at least for a moment. And in that moment, Richard Evans chose to build something that couldn't be taken by fire or steel. He brought Claire and the children, Adrian, wide-eyed and curious, and newborn William, bundled tightly in his mother's arms, to a small village just outside Lyon. The roads were cracked, the houses worn by time and neglect, but the hills still rolled green and the sky was open. At the edge of the village stood an old stone house, half collapsed, forgotten during the years of occupation. The roof was gone, the windows shattered, vines had crept in through every crack. Richard walked through it slowly, boots crunching on broken tiles, sunlight pouring in through the empty frame where the ceiling used to be. He ran a hand along the cold wall. "This," he said to Claire, "will be home." She looked around, unsure. It didn't look like much, but then again, nothing in their lives had, not at first. And so, day by day, brick by brick, they rebuilt it, together. Richard worked with his hands, learning as he went. Villagers came to help. A carpenter who had lost his sons, a mason with half a leg and a full heart, and even a few Allied soldiers still stationed nearby, eager to lend their strength to something that wasn't destruction. Claire planted herbs near the kitchen window. She taught Adrian how to knead bread and hum lullabies to his baby brother. They shared meals by candlelight, huddled under blankets when the roof was only half done, and listened to the wind like it was a language they were still learning. At night, Richard often sat by the window with William asleep on his chest, watching the moonlight dance on the hills. He didn't talk much, but he didn't need to. Claire could see it in his eyes, the way he looked at the children, at the house, at her, the way he didn't flinch anymore when thunder rolled in the distance. They were healing, slowly, quietly. And then, one golden evening as summer approached, they stood among ruins again, not from sorrow, but to write a new chapter. The old village church had been bombed early in the war. Only part of the facade remained, and half of the bell tower, but someone had cleared the rubble. Wildflowers grew between the cracks in the stone floor, and it was there, beneath the soft light of dusk, that Claire and Richard were married. No organ, no choir, just the voices of a few Allied soldiers, a handful of villagers, and the rustle of wind through broken stained glass. Claire wore a simple white dress borrowed from a farmer's wife. Richard stood beside her in his uniform, now patched and sun-worn, but still carrying the weight of everything he had lived through. They exchanged vows with no priest, just a promise whispered through trembling lips. "I won't leave," he said. "Not ever again." "I'll stay," she replied, "even when the silence is heavy." They kissed as the sun dipped behind the hills, and for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, the world around them was quiet, but not empty. That night they danced barefoot on the old stones, holding each other like survivors, holding on to light. The war had taken so much, but in the heart of a wounded country, two souls found something stronger than ruin. They found home. Even after the dust settled and the world slowly began to repair its shattered pieces, not everything could return to the way it was. Some wounds stayed quiet, some hearts healed crooked, and some people, like Richard and Claire, learned that peace didn't mean forgetting. It meant choosing what to carry forward. By the time autumn painted the trees outside Lyon in soft gold and amber, Richard had developed a habit. Each morning he would sit at the kitchen table with a pen, a stack of worn envelopes, and a silence that spoke louder than any voice. He had begun writing letters. At first, it was for the families of men he had once commanded, soldiers who had gone missing behind enemy lines, whose names were marked only by question marks and faded notes in official reports. Richard knew some of them hadn't made it home, but still, he wrote, not to explain, not to justify, but to remember. He told mothers about their sons' courage, told sisters about the laughter shared between battles, told children that their fathers were more than uniforms and photographs. Each letter was written by hand, carefully, as if every word could bring back a piece of someone lost. One evening, Claire found him sitting at the window, a half-finished letter resting in his lap. He looked at her with tired eyes and said, "This one's for my mother, the one who raised both of us. I never told her how he died. I never told her how I lived." He paused, fingers tightening around the pen. "She deserves to know, even if it's too late." Claire said nothing. She simply sat beside him, her hand brushing his, anchoring him back to the present. While Richard poured his memories onto paper, Claire gave her hands to something, Eldis, to the fragile lives left in the ruins of war. Word had spread through nearby towns about the woman in the white apron who had once nursed wounded soldiers and now offered help to the smallest victims of the conflict. The children who had no homes, no parents, no names anyone remembered. They came in quiet waves, little feet, wide eyes, and empty hands. Claire welcomed them with warm soup, soft blankets, and stories whispered in broken French, Italian, or German. She stitched torn sleeves, treated fevers, and held trembling fingers through nightmares. One girl, barely 5 years old, refused to speak for weeks. Claire sat with her each day by the fire, humming lullabies and brushing her tangled hair. One afternoon, the child climbed into Claire's lap and whispered, "You smell like my mother." Claire didn't answer. She just held her tighter. Richard watched from afar, often standing in the doorway, seeing the way Claire bent down to meet each child's eyes. He realized she wasn't trying to save them. She was showing them something he had once forgotten, that the world could still be kind. One evening, as the last light faded and the children were asleep, Richard approached Claire in the garden. The leaves rustled gently above them, and the earth smelled of rain and quiet growth. He took her hand, calloused and warm. "You taught me," he said, voice low, "that love doesn't have to come after peace. It can begin in the middle of the fire, in the middle of fear, even in the middle of the worst things we've seen." Claire looked at him, her eyes soft with the weight of everything they had lived, and everything they had yet to face. They didn't speak after that. There was no need. The silence between them had changed. It no longer held grief, it held understanding, a quiet promise. The past would never let go of them completely, but together they had found a way to turn their scars into shelter. And through every letter, every healing touch, every quiet night, they were helping the world do the same. The war didn't end with a single sound. It faded slowly, like a distant echo, like a shadow finally letting go of the light. When the final orders came, Richard stood once more at a crossroads between duty and home. He had already sacrificed enough, but some missions aren't about orders. They're about what's right. He was asked to return, to lead one last mission into a land still scarred by pain, the kind of place where hope had nearly vanished, and where some lives still waited in silence to be found. Claire didn't beg him to stay. She simply held him tightly at the gates of their rebuilt home, her face buried in his chest, heart pounding with both fear and faith. "Come back," she whispered, "not as a hero, come back as a father." And he did. When he returned, his uniform was worn, his face even more tired, but his arms held something precious. A small child, wrapped in a wool blanket, too thin, too quiet, but alive. An orphan. One of the forgotten. A boy with no name, no home, no one left in the world. Until now. Claire opened the door and welcomed him in with no hesitation. She didn't need to ask questions. She only reached out, took the child in her arms, and whispered something soft in French, something about family, about warmth, about second chances. And so their home grew. From war and ashes, from silence and sorrow, from sacrifice and impossible choices, a family was born. Not one written in bloodlines, but in kindness, in courage, in the decision to keep going even when everything had been taken. While the world counted losses, they chose to count beginnings. They planted new trees in the garden, built a second room in the back of the house, taught the children how to find stars in the night sky and how to listen for each other's laughter. They never forgot what they had lived through, but they also never let it define them. Because sometimes the greatest act of bravery isn't fighting on the front lines. It's choosing love after the fire, choosing to rebuild, choosing to raise your voice, not in anger, but in memory. Richard never wrote books, Claire never gave speeches, but their story lived on, in the lives they touched, in the letters kept in drawers, in the hearts of children who grew up surrounded by peace that had been earned through pain. And now, their story lives with you. Did you already know this story? What would you have done in Richard's place? What other stories about soldiers and veterans should be told so they are never lost to time? Imagine the final images as the music swells. Richard lifting the orphan child into his arms as the sun sets behind the hills. Claire brushing the hair of all three children as they sit near the fireplace. The ruins of the old church now blooming with wildflowers. A single letter resting on a windowsill with the words, "For those we carry with us." If this story moved you, don't let it be forgotten. Subscribe to the OR channel and turn on notifications to hear more stories like this one. Stories of quiet courage, of sacrifice, of the people who chose to hope when the world had nearly given up. We'll be waiting for you in the next one. Until then, remember them and carry their legacy forward.